Welcome everyone to a history of AC cars. If you are familiar with the AC brand, you can be forgiven for thinking that this company was always a tiny specialist car builder. Maybe you are only familiar with the AC Cobra. Histories of the AC Cobra tend to belittle the history of AC cars, no doubt from a point of ignorance. In fact, in the 1920s, AC was more of a force to be reckoned with. They were largely self-sufficient, produced an amazing array of cars from luxury saloons to racing specials, and set a large number of world records, not forgetting a few competition victories too. I'm only going to cover up to the early 1990s so that this doesn't get too long. I also won't dwell on the business details, as I think you will be more interested in the cars themselves. This is part one of two parts, as the story is long. To find the very beginning of this business, we have to rewind to 1899, although many written histories claim 1900 or 1901 as the beginning. A very talented engineer, John Weller, teamed up with his three brothers and created a business called Weller Brothers. The intention was to build all manner of road vehicles and engines. The business was located in West Norwood, London. In 1902, the business reformed because they now had some financial backing from wealthy businessman John Portwine. Portwine owned a chain of butcher shops in London, and he had some foresight to see the future in the automobile industry. With more capital to make things happen, a prototype Weller car was designed in time to appear at the 1903 London Motor Show. This car featured a subframe to support the drivetrain, mounted onto the main chassis via 3 points, thus isolating the chassis from drive torque. The radiator was mounted very low down, permitting a nice sloping nose to the bodywork. A relatively large 4-cylinder engine was installed. A big article by the Autocar magazine saw a great future for this design. Unfortunately, it is one thing to create a brilliantly designed prototype, and quite another to set up a production line for the first time. As the cost mounted, they wisely abandoned this car and set their sights on more modest beginnings. With the company reformed as Autocars and Accessories in 1904, Weller designed a more modest vehicle, a 3-wheeler commercial box van called the Auto Carrier. Portwine was aware of the potential for a small motorised commercial vehicle in London. It had a single driven wheel at the rear with an epicyclic gearbox within its hub. The single-cylinder engine drove it via a chain. The engine featured twin flywheels with spokes that acted as fan blades. The auto carrier was a great success, and many large companies had fleets of auto carriers. Customers included railway companies such as the Great Western Railway, also some household names such as Selfridges and Boots the Chemist. In 1907, passenger versions of the auto carrier were introduced, with the passenger seat in front of the driver. The auto carrier model name was abbreviated to AC, and the AC Tricar was born. Light cycle cars were popular at this time to entice motorcyclists into car ownership. A version with the passenger alongside the driver was called the AC Sociable. As the company grew, they reformed as Auto Carriers 1911 Limited, and they moved to Thames Ditton in Surrey. Weller could now indulge his desire to design a sporting 4-wheeled car. He drew up a design during 1912 for a car that would weigh only half a ton. It had its gearbox in unit with the rear axle, many decades before rear gearbox became a big selling point. Admittedly, this was part of the live axle, but the castings were of aluminium, and Weller was careful to keep the unsprung mass down. Rather than go to the expense of designing and building their own lightweight engine, they found a suitable engine in France called the Fivette. This was a 1.5 litre 4-cylinder unit. This new AC was first built in 1913. The aforementioned gearbox had 3 speeds and drove via a worm gear final drive. World War I interrupted this production. AC made their war contribution, building some armoured vehicles. When peace returned, production now concentrated on the 4-wheeled car. Sadly, the engine factory in France had been damaged, limiting the production of the Fivette engines, although a few more AC Fivettes were built. These cars had a disc brake mounted on the transmission on the back of the rear axle. With the Fivette engine supply being outstripped by the success of this AC, they found an alternative engine maker in the UK, Anzani. This was another 1.5 litre 4-cylinder engine with a good reputation for its reliability, and light enough to meet AC's requirements. Again, demand for AC's light car took up the entire output of engines from Anzani. Going into the 1920s, the expanding AC concern went through more changes. It became known as Auto Carriers Limited, and shortly afterwards AC Cars Limited. A new figure entered the company, one SF Edge, previously famous for his time at Napier and his early motor racing exploits. By 1922 he was the governing director of AC, but sadly Weller and Portwine resigned. However, Edge brought a few ex-Napier personnel along with him, including engineers, so things were still looking promising. The AC concern now involved the factory in the High Street plus the ferry works around the corner in Summer Road, Thames Ditton. Many of the cars produced were known as the AC Royal, produced with various 2- or 4-seater coachwork. These were high-quality cars that gained a good reputation among their enthusiastic owners. Some were entered in Concours d'Elegance rallies and won prizes as the most stylish cars entered. Each rolling chassis produced was test-driven for 60 miles before receiving its coachwork, with temporary seats rigged up. The engines had already been run on test beds. After every road test, everything was tested and adjusted if necessary. After coachwork was fitted, more test runs were made to check for any rattles or squeaks. Finally, the car would be painted with 8 coats. Some owners referred to their ACs as the Rolls-Royce of light cars. When AC themselves quoted them, Rolls-Royce took exception and told AC to desist. Meanwhile, SF Edge started an intensive period of record attempts carried out at the Banks Motor Racing Circuit at Brooklands. These were records for lightweight small engine cars, and AC built special versions for this. By the end of 1921, the light AC held over 100 records set at Brooklands for average speeds over various distances. No other make of car came close to this. Also in 1921, several ACs entered fuel consumption trials, with figures as high as 64 mpg being achieved. Although verified by the RAC, these were not figures likely to be achieved in normal motoring by customers. In 1922, the new speed records kept coming. Speed records over 400 and 800 miles, then a 12-hour race averaging over 71 miles per hour, plus many other records. Perhaps the most notable record was covering over 100 miles within 1 hour from a standing start. AC also entered numerous races and hill climbs and won over 120 awards during 1922 to 24. I will return to the story of records and races later. Running in parallel with all of this is the tale of Weller's masterpiece. In his spare time during World War I, Weller drew up plans for his design of a light 6-cylinder engine. By 1919, pre-production engines had been built. Initially it was a 1.5 litre engine, but this was then increased to 2 litres by enlarging the bore. This amazingly advanced engine had the following features: cast aluminium alloy block and sump, wet cylinder liners, cross-flow iron head, overhead camshaft, slightly inclined valves and part spherical combustion chamber, although not quite an all-out semi. At first the camshaft was driven via a vertical shaft using skew gears at the rear of the engine. That was soon changed to a very long timing chain, tensioned by a spring steel strip which AC patented. The magneto was also driven from the rear of the crankshaft via a cross shaft, because the torsional vibrations of a straight 6 would cause problems from the front end. A fan belt at the front end for the fan, and later on the water pump, can damp out much of those vibrations without noise. The water pump was initially driven off the front of the camshaft. A pulley on the rear of the camshaft drove the dynamo. An added benefit of alloy around the main bearings is that it is effective at carrying away heat. It took until 1921 to develop the engine sufficiently to offer new cars with it fitted. This remarkable engine remained in production until 1963, and still looked quite advanced in design even at that stage. Initially this engine produced 40 bhp at 3000 rpm as the standard engine rating. Returning now to records and races, the AC6 also made quite an impression. In 1926 a 6-cylinder AC achieved 50 miles from a standing start, averaging over 90 miles an hour. The following year an AC6 was tested under RAC observation, where it drove for 12 hours at an average of 67 miles an hour. More impressive was a stint at the Montlhéry circuit in France, where another AC6 broke the 24 hours world record when it averaged over 82 miles per hour. In 1926, an AC6 became the first British car to win the Monte Carlo Rally, driven by the Honourable Victor Bruce. The following year, his wife Mildred entered the Monte in a large AC6 saloon car. Although she finished 6th overall, she took the prize for the First Lady finisher. She already had a history of fast driving and is reputed to be the first British lady to receive a speeding ticket back in 1911. Amazingly, after that 1927 Monte Carlo adventure, Mildred and Victor went on a 5,000-mile trial covering road tests around southern Europe and then northern Africa. They were accompanied by an RAC observer and kept a detailed diary of events. Not satisfied with these little jaunts, the Bruces rented Brooklyn Circuit in December 1927 for an attempt to cover 15,000 miles in 10 days. After the first 12 hours, they had averaged 79 miles per hour. Due to the time of year, they had to contend with fog, rain, snow and strong winds. Not deterred, they started to break records at the 4,000 and 5,000 miles mark. By the 5th day, a reserve driver from AC Cars helped them out. But the physical demands of the task took its toll and Victor crashed over an embankment at 80 miles an hour. Both driver and car were relatively unscathed, considering the speed of the crash, although it took some hours to repair the AC. They then pressed on with the challenge as the weather got even worse. There was no full windscreen left, and things were a tad chilly. Yet they made up the lost time and were back on course for more records. They completed the 15,000 miles in just under 8 days, far ahead of the target. 7 records were set during this epic run. There are even more exploits around Europe by the Bruces, but too much to detail in this little chat. By 1927, the AC6 engine had been improved. The crankshaft was now of 2 pieces, which included a short adapter piece at the rear, incorporating the timing sprocket. It also incorporated an additional journal, meaning that this 6-cylinder engine now had 5 main bearings. This gave better support around the rear auxiliary drives. The power output was increased to 56 bhp. The surprising omission from this advanced engine was torsional damping for the long crankshaft. This was resolved to some extent by introducing rubber damping onto the flywheel, and a few years later making a 2-part flywheel. The range of production ACs available to the public included an open 2-seater, a 2-seater coupe, long wheelbase coupe, and 2- and 4-door saloons. Model names included Empire and Royal for the 4-cylinder cars, and Asica and Mercedes for 6-cylinder cars. In fact, the model name 6, written in letters, was a registered model name. Note that the word coupe at this time still meant cut, referring to the rear of the roof and window area being shortened for a sporting look. So far, all of this success is starting to sound like a fairy tale. Success in real life includes challenges and some failures. At one stage, derailleur conrods were tried on the 6-cylinder engine, with very bad results. Fatigue failures led to some expensive damage, and AC hastily reverted to steel rods. In the late 1920s, development seemed to stagnate. I've heard that SF Edge had a fearsome reputation for being strict, which might not have been conducive to letting design engineers make progress. That's just me speculating. There was some debate about the continued use of the rear 3-speed gearbox. AC was also a bit slow to make front-wheel brakes standard rather than an option. Whatever the problems were, by 1927 the company name changed again to AC Mercedes Limited. A new model was introduced in 1928, the AC Magna, available as an open tourer or a saloon. 1929 saw many car makers go down, and AC was one of them. SF Edge left. The AC service department was kept running while the receivers looked for a buyer. Meanwhile, a pair of AC engines were sold for use in the R100 airship for onboard electricity generation. Evidently their lightweight made them ideal. AC also offered a marine version of the engine, although I don't know how many of these were sold. In 1930, buyers were found in the form of brothers William and Charles Hurlock, yet the AC car history almost came to a full stop. The Hurlocks had no plans to build ACs. They wanted these facilities for their existing road haulage and bodybuilding business. Yet such was the enthusiasm of loyal AC customers that the Hurlocks were persuaded to keep the service centre running and then restart production of the AC Magna. They even decided to finally get that much needed design update, the gearbox in unit with the engine. The design engineer was given a budget of only £50 to achieve this, and soon enough there was an ENV 4-speed crash gearbox attached to the AC engine. Rear axles could now be conventional ones sourced from reputable makers. It also meant that a new lower slung chassis could be designed for a more modern and pleasing look. This was all done remarkably quickly during 1931-32 before putting the new ACs on the market. By this time the engine's auxiliary drives had evolved, with the rear cross shaft driving the distributor on the left and the dynamo on the right. The new lower slung AC was called the AC Ace. Chassis numbers had the prefix L for low chassis. The letter X would indicate left-hand drive. Although the Hurlocks kept AC car production going, it was now a very small sideline to their business as a whole. ACs were made to order, and across the 1930s decade only about 700 cars were built. One of their slogans was the Savile Row of Motordom, which was a reference to high-grade men's tailors in Savile Row, London. Now that AC was a small sideline business, it could not afford to be as self-sufficient as before. I'm guessing that's why they approached the Standard Car Company to see if they could use the underslung chassis that the Swallow Sidecar Company was starting to use. And use it they did. AC Coach built a variety of body styles onto this chassis, or rather 3 versions of the chassis. Mostly the longer 9 feet 7-inch wheelbase chassis, on which AC offered a choice of 4-seater sports or drop-head coupe with dicky seat. Also a fixed-head coupe known as the 246-seater. It had a hammock-style rear seat under the small roof plus the dicky seat. Then there was a short wheelbase version, which earned the nickname the Flea. By this time the engine had improved further with quieter valve gear and triple SU carburettors. By the mid-30s, power output was a choice of 70 or 80 bhp. A few of the smaller cars were fitted with the belt-driven R0 supercharger, giving 90 bhp. AC maintained their reputation for high build quality and attention to detail, as well as good handling. A nice detail touch worth mentioning is the aluminium pedal heads for the clutch and brake pedals. These had the AC emblem. AC continued to fit these to cars right up to the 427 Cobras in the 1960s. AC did not indulge in the expensive world of motor racing, apart from a few rallies. It was largely left to owners to go racing and rallying. An early rally victory in 1933 was achieved by Kitty Brunel, who beat 3 other ACs who all finished in the top 7. That was the Hastings RAC rally. To be accurate, Kitty Brunel won Class 2 and also achieved the highest point score of the rally in what was a complex point system. In 1934, a saloon AC was introduced called the Greyhound. Confusingly, some of the AC Aces carried a leaping greyhound mascot as well as the new saloon car. Some journalists unfairly compare the progress of AC and SS Jaguar, using the standard design underslung chassis as the starting point. AC had no plans to expand in the motor industry, keeping it as a specialist sideline that can provide high quality coach building. It is interesting to note that SS Jaguar assisted AC at times. I get the impression that the Hurlocks had quite a friendly rapport with other British car bosses, since AC was never likely to put others out of business. As time went on, more body styles appeared, including aero saloons, following the trend for pseudo-streamlining with a long tail. This was a golden age for styling and coach building. One of the most stylish shapes was the special design by the Earl of March, later to be owner of the Goodwood motor racing circuit. In 1937, AC made their first exports to the USA. In fact, I recall watching a 1941 film called They Met in Bombay, featuring Clark Gable, who was seen driving an AC. The AC staff noted the startling bright paint colours favoured by their American customers. AC still had to keep up with the times and demand. They did a slight redesign to increase passenger space by moving the engine and bulkhead forwards. This only helped a little, and so in 1939 AC introduced an overslung chassis with longer leaf springs for more comfort. I believe it had anti-roll bars fitted. The new model was called the Flying 16. Production had only reached single figures when the war intervened. The company's other engineering interests had already been dealing with government projects even before the war started. These included aircraft components. Once Britain entered the war, AC also got to work building military trailers for water tanks. AC's coachwork department built bodies for fire engines on Bedford and Ford chassis. AC's government work expanded, so they acquired a factory on Tagg's Island where various guns and gun components were manufactured. AC were able to cope with rush orders to replenish supplies when needed. Meanwhile, the Thames Ditton factory was building parts for the Fairey Aircraft Company. Immediately after the war, AC still had government contracts to fulfill. Meanwhile, work on the design of the first post-war AC was underway. Or perhaps I should say arguments. AC now had two design engineers who did not see eye to eye. They joined E.H. Sidney in the engineering lineup. There was Alan Turner, who became known later for his work on the Greyhound and Cobra and other AC models. Then there was the Polish aerospace engineer Z.T. Marszewski. While conflict might sound like a bad thing, I personally think it can bring out the best by discussing designs rather than everyone agreeing. Unity is overrated. AC were continuing their plan to produce a more comfortable and practical car to meet customer demands. For some reason they ditched the Flying 16, yet Sidney and Turner both wanted to create an all-new car with full-width body, box chassis, independent front suspension with torsion bar springs, and maybe a new engine too. This all sounded rather optimistic for a small concern. It's quite rare for any car manufacturer to create an entirely new car, including engine, except in the very early days of motoring. Both Marszewski and Charles Hurlock were more practical and maybe more aware of their market. Some of their loyal customers threatened to switch allegiance if AC introduced this newfangled independent suspension, although I'm not sure who they would switch to. Jay Leno is spot on when he says the last of the old technology is often superior to the first of the new. This wasn't so clear-cut with the suspension debate though. A beam axle would sacrifice some ride comfort potential, but AC's customers are sports car enthusiasts. Early IFS systems saw cars rolling badly and chassis that were not up to the task. That is why chassis design evolved very fast from the 1940s to the 60s. Independent suspension needs much higher torsional stiffness than beam axles, the latter requiring extra lateral stiffness because of the high roll centres. It is interesting to see the scale model AC made in 1946, reminiscent of a certain Jaguar but predating it. Most histories of AC simply state that they reused the pre-war chassis as designed by Standard. For many years I disputed this. Although it is clearly an evolution of the underslung design, it has some subtle but important improvements. Only in recent years did I find out the truth, not shown in any AC books. It was an SS Jaguar engineer who did the large part of this redesign back in the late 1930s for their big saloon cars. This is part of what I meant earlier about SS helping out AC. The original chassis was almost all of channel section girder. The improved version had the channels boxed in the front and rear ends of the chassis, but leaving the central cruciform section of channel girders. When chassis members meet at right angles, it is important to have closed box sections, or tubing, to achieve high torsional stiffness on the frame. However, if you box a cruciform frame, you add more weight than stiffness. Although I said you don't need very high torsional stiffness with beam axles, it still helps if the frame is not too flexible. I think SS had also done this to some of their later sports car chassis. SS had also added a neat attachment for the rear ends of the front springs. Rather than traditional swinging shackle, it had graphite slippers for the spring to slide in and out. This gave much better lateral location. For the post-war AC version, the rear underpan gave some added lateral stiffness. The front cross member had to be redesigned for the AC engine mountings. It is mainly of box section, but with large gusset plates. Many people mock leaf springs nowadays, but one should never mock old tech that you don't understand. The geometry of different designs is quite involved, since they have to take a variety of loadings. The front springs on the AC were fairly wide, and also asymmetric, with the axle mounted slightly nearer the rear ends. Inclined telescopic dampers were a modern feature. Rear dampers were lever arm initially, but later upgraded to telescopics. The rear springs also got an early upgrade with an unusual flat damper leaf on top. A prototype chassis was built with a pre-war style Tourer body on to permit testing. The engine had been updated, new mountings were designed wider apart than before, a new water pump made its appearance now on the side of the engine, allowing the engine to fit under a lower bonnet. Another feature taken from SS was the SU cold start auxiliary carburettor, which was a feature of many post-war Jaguars too. AC had wanted much better braking, and this car featured 12-inch drums with Girling hydrostatic front brakes, where the linings always touch the drums. They are self-adjusting. Rear brakes were Girling mechanical, but with AC's own balance mechanism that works extremely well. For the new body style, famous car advert artist Harold Connolly drew up a few ideas. Some of them resembled the final shape quite closely. In fact, some of his drawings were used on the early brochures. I've noticed that many people comment on the high roof line, yet the roof is not particularly high. The waistline and bonnet are low by contemporary standards, giving an amazing level of all-round visibility. Body panelling was made from duralumin left over from wartime aircraft production. This was supported by a traditional ash frame. I wonder if Marchescu, with his aerospace background, designed it, because it is a much stronger looking structure than many other coach builders' ash frames. For some reason this model never received a proper name, so it became known as the 2-litre saloon. Regular followers will be aware that this is the model that I have lifelong association with. The prototype saloon appeared on the road in early 1947, ready to launch the model. A few detailed changes were made. The bench front seat idea was abandoned, leaving the gear stick and handbrake still in their forward position. Both the Autocar and the Motor magazines described this car in 1947 in March. Autocar felt moved to comment that the brakes were so good, reminded them of when the first four-wheel brake cars appeared, such was the improvement. Selling the cars wasn't as easy as most articles suggest. There was a 33% purchase tax on most cars at this time, but if the car was priced at over £1,000 it attracted double purchase tax. The exact rate seemed to vary, but as you can see from these early AC adverts, the AC's basic price was right near the threshold. The result was that certain accessories were offered as optional extras, such as a radio and a heater. It must have been a struggle to keep the costs down during this period. Initially this AC had a neat single-piece bonnet hinged at the rear. Pulling a lever integral with the mascot would spring it open and would be pulled again to release it back down. Contrary to what other AC histories state, this feature made it into production for at least 10 cars, being revised in design before being dropped. Once into production, this model became AC's biggest selling car, not counting three-wheeled AC models. They offered a drop-head version, but only built about 13 before entering an agreement with Buckland Bodyworks to build their own open-top version. This had some slight restyling, a fold-flat screen and a different interior. A small number of chassis went to other coach builders who created shooting brake versions. These evaded the purchase tax by claiming that they were commercial vehicles that had the tax exemption. There was more going on behind the scenes. With war contracts fulfilled, AC made good use of their expanded facilities by building three-wheel invalid vehicles. This became a lucrative long-term contract with the government. Another interesting diversion was the building of 4 electric trains for Southend Pier. On a smaller scale, they produced the American Bagboy Golfer's Aid under license. Meanwhile, Marchescu got started on a project to design a horizontally opposed engine. He started with an experimental flat twin, but progress was slow. I'll return to this later. AC exported quite a few AC saloons to Australia and a few elsewhere. Both Motor and Autocar gave very good road test reports in 1949. Of interest is that Autocar tested a later saloon in 1952, and if anything was more keen than before. Maybe that is a benefit of not trying new technology. something that often bankrupts car companies. Journalists like to match cars as competitors by price, yet the AC had its own niche market. The Rover P4 was more for comfort and luxury. The Jaguar Mark V was much heavier and had a much bigger engine. The Bristol 401 seems like the closest match, except that it cost more than double the price of the AC. By 1951, all the car sales attracted the double purchase tax, resulting in the price of the AC skyrocketing. Predictably, sales slumped. For the 1952 British Motor Show, AC launched a four-door version of the saloon, plus an improved drop-head coupe. The drop-heads never sold, but most customers now bought the four-door saloon. The 2-litre saloon only saw modest activity in motorsport, mostly rallies. One was privately entered in the 1949 Monte Carlo rally, but they accidentally filled its tank with diesel at a French fuel station. William Hurlock's son Derek entered one of the works demonstrator cars in a few rallies. This car was used as a development vehicle shortly afterwards. It had an experimental AC engine installed with 11:1 compression ratio. They also divided the front axle to create a swing axle system similar to conversions done by Leslie Bellamy on Austin Sevens. Perhaps one race that showed that the saloon had potential was the production touring car race on the Silverstone Grand Prix circuit. That was in 1952. A second-hand AC saloon was entered by Jim Mayers. While the big 3.5-litre Mark VII Jags dominated the race, the AC competed within the 2-litre class against a few Bristols. Ultimately coming second in class to a works-ended Bristol, it beat a pair of 2.5-litre Rileys. Its average speed was over 68 miles per hour, keeping in mind that the AC tops out at just over 80 miles per hour. I can vouch for its surprisingly good road holding. An opportunity arose thanks to the boss of Buckland Bodyworks. AC was shown a sports racing special designed by John Tajiro, inspired by the Ferrari Barchettas. It featured all-independent suspension with transverse leaf springs and a lightweight tubular chassis. The simplicity of this chassis meant easy production in-house. Vin Davison was involved with building these, and he was taken on by AC to help develop it. Alan Turner also got to work on making the design suitable and legal for road use. It was launched at the 1953 Motor Show. The prototype had rack and pinion steering, as is the preferred system with independent suspension. Unfortunately, the steering rack, which was from a Morris Minor, could not be sourced in the quantity needed. Therefore, AC had to make do with the traditional steering box. The revised styling created a stunning-looking sports car. With an uprated AC engine of 85 bhp, it could exceed the magic 100 mph figure. The Tajiro car had already been race developed. This was a handy shortcut to introducing an all-out sports car back into the AC range. The model name Ace was revived. The production Ace was heavier than the Tajiro, but at 3/4 of a ton it was still pretty light. With the lightweight AC engine there was a slight rearward weight bias to the Ace. With independent suspension, the Ace was sure-footed for good road holding on bumpy surfaces. The chassis of 3-inch diameter tubes was certainly light, but I suspect its stiffness was fairly low, only one of its cross members being tubular. Like many early independently sprung cars, it rolled on corners and the wheels leaned with it. Despite this, the handling was very nimble, road holding impressive, especially with Michelin X radials, and straight line speed was pretty fast for the day. By 1954, AC launched a closed version that revived another old model name, Asica. The body styling was nicely revised rather than simply adding a roof. The result is one of the prettiest sports cars ever produced. No doubt influenced by certain Italian stylists, but somehow more British. The chassis became stiffer by virtue of having to mount the final drive on rubber to keep down noise inside. A second tubular crossmember was added to support the nose of the final drive. More luxury was a feature of the Asica, with soft trim to reduce internal noise further. AC was still leaving owners to enter races and rallies if they desired. These early aces had a few class wins in rallies and also entered the 12 hours endurance race at Sebring. They didn't win, coming fourth in class, but they were proven to be reliable. What they needed was more power and disc brakes. I have a theory that AC neglected development of their engine due to the work going on with the flat 6 design. After seeing aces performing at races, AC did a few updates to the straight 6 design, including a slight up rating to 90 bhp. Meanwhile, the 1956 Suez crisis and the resultant petrol rationing prompted AC to enter the microcar market. With the experience of the invalid three-wheelers, they introduced a three-wheeler called the AC Petite. AC sold thousands of these little vehicles. It was Ken Rudd who persuaded AC to put a Bristol 2-litre engine in his Ace. Tajiro's had previously used the Bristol engine, which was derived from the pre-war BMW unit. Rudd entered the 1956 production sports car race at Goodwood and won it. AC were convinced and added the Bristol engine as an option. The Ace Bristol's top speed was 115 miles per hour. I think it was also Rudd who encouraged AC to introduce front disc brakes as an option. The Ace Bristols trounced the competition in the USA for the relevant sports car series. They were so popular that in one race, the Columbia Trophy race, 20 Aces entered and took the first 19 places. In the background, Marcheschi was still developing his engine and had produced a flat 4. This was installed in a prototype saloon that resembled a stretched Seeker. This prototype car had coil springs all round, with double wishbones at the front and swing axles at the rear. Presumably it was intended as a replacement for the 2-litre saloon. The engine ran well, but lacking the refinement that AC were accustomed to, with a typical lumpy flat 4 sound. That might be why Marcheschi went on to try for a flat 6, thus stretching out this long development even further. Returning to the Ace Bristols, in the late 1950s they entered the Le Mans 24 Hours. In 1957, AC made a special streamlined nose for the Ace that was driven by Ken Rudd and Peter Bolton. They came second in the 2-litre class and 10th overall. Sadly, a major factory fire in 1957 set back sales and development for the AC company. For 1958, AC entered a largely standard car in the 24-hour race at Le Mans, plus a very special Ace. The latter had a space-frame tubular chassis, long aerodynamic bodywork, and a special long crossover swing-arm suspension at the rear. Front suspension was double wishbones with helical springs. That sounds similar to that prototype flat 4 saloon. This new car had very limited development, let alone race owning, but survived the race with only minor trouble. It finished second in the 2-litre class and 8th overall. The standard Ace followed it around to finish 9th overall and 3rd in class. The special Ace had passed through the Mulsanne speed trap at 154 miles an hour. For 1959, a second-hand Ace Bristol was prepared by AC and entered by Ken Rudd. In the blistering heat, many other cars, big and small, fell by the wayside. The lone AC won its class, as the only car still running in class, and was 7th overall. The 1959 Motor Show saw the prototype AC Greyhound make its debut. 2-litre saloon production had petered out in 1958, and the Greyhound offered a 2+2 seater in a sporting fastback style. It featured double wishbone front suspension and rack and pinion steering. At the rear, a very compact semi-trailing arm suspension which provided plenty of interior space. The prototype had twin tubes in its chassis, similar to the Ace, but the production Greyhound chassis was of square tubes. Brakes were discs at the front, drums at the rear, and a split braking circuit. Glass fibre internal panels helped to reduce weight. The complete car weighed 2,400 pounds, or 1,090 kilograms. The styling of the prototype was not well received. It appeared very soon after the DB4 Aston, with inevitable comparisons made. For the production version, a more pleasing rear window and boot lid design were drawn up. The nose was slightly altered, with the grille that later appeared on Aces and Cobras. The final drive casing was of light alloy made by AC, with ENV internals. The engines offered were the Bristol 2-litre and the longer stroke Bristol 2.2. Sadly, this car that should have carried the company forwards ran into some setbacks. For its first magazine road test, there was a disagreement between Turner and one of the Hurlocks about which wheels and tyres to fit. So the road testers tried two options, using 15 and 16-inch rims. Each option had its pros and cons, but the Michelin X radials tended to let go with little warning. By the time of another road test, things were far better, but the Greyhound had run into another setback as Bristol ended production of their 6-cylinder engines. 5 Greyhounds received the final variant of the AC6, producing 105 bhp. One was fitted with the Rudd-Speed Ford Zephyr 2.6 engine. Another became a testbed for Marcheski's Flat 6. AC's bosses shopped around for alternative engines. They approached Jaguar about both the XK engine and their newly acquired Daimler V8 2.5. They also tried to get the Buick V8 before Rover got their hand on it. The final end to the Greyhound was the Cobra, which terminated all other AC models due to the scale of Cobra demand. For many years I've referred to the Greyhound as Alan Turner's unsung masterpiece. Today this car has got the recognition it deserves, since true connoisseurs can think beyond how fast a car is. However, at a time when bigger engines were becoming the in thing in the UK, it would have sold better with more power. Although I called it a 2+2-seater, it was on the borderline of being a full 4-seater, with a top speed of 110 miles per hour and 0 to 60 in 11.4 seconds. Its performance almost matches my 1982 Reliant Scimitar with its 2.8 engine. Journalists tend to try and choose what other cars were AC's competitors, but AC operated in its own small niche. They were always slightly different. AC offered an extensive choice of options on the Greyhound, from engine and transmission to interior trim etc. Still the Savile Row of motordom. Returning to the final instalment about Marcheski's flat engines, he built some flat 6s of 2 and then 2.4 litres. The latter produced 165 bhp, which was quite impressive for 2.4 litres. It utilised light magnesium and aluminium alloys in its construction, although I don't have a figure for its weight. Marcheski was also drawing up designs for new sports cars that this engine could be installed in. One design made it into reality as a prototype, despite Cobra production halting most other activity. As for the engine, by the time it was finished, it was possible to choose from numerous mass-produced engines from other manufacturers at a fraction of the cost, all also without the need to thoroughly test and develop a new engine. This flat 6 was tested in an AC Greyhound and maybe one or two other ACs, but never entered production. This work was a sideline for Marcheski, who was more involved with the government contracts for AC. And talking of engines, Ken Rudd lent a helping hand again. One of his businesses, called Rudd-Speed, had experience of uprating the 2.6 litre Ford Zephyr engine. He offered 5 stages of tuning, with stage 5 producing 170 bhp. He tried it out in an Ace. The engine was a little heavier, but not too much. With the engine being much lower in height, AC was able to restyle the front of the Ace with a lower bonnet and revised air intake. The latter was reminiscent of the early 50s Pininfarina-bodied Maseratis. The blistering performance of these Rudd-Speed Aces included top speeds over 135 miles per hour and 0 to 60 in 6 seconds. These Ace 2.6s cost less than Ace Bristols, yet they did not sell well. The Zephyr engine was not race-honed and possibly wasn't viewed as high quality. In any case, having launched at the 1961 Motor Show, it was another casualty of the forthcoming Cobra production, and only 37 of these Aces were produced. A small number of Asiga 2.6s were also built, but they retained the original Asiga styling. That brings part 1 to an end. Tune in for part 2 as the Cobra enters the scene. Thanks for listening.